At some point in your business journey, you will pivot, whether that's shifting your messaging, reaching a completely new target audience, or changing your offers altogether. You will make some kind of shift in your business. But what do you do with your podcast when you make a pivot? Do you start a new podcast or do something else? That's exactly what I'm talking about today, specifically how to rebrand a podcast when you pivot in your business. Now, if you're new here, well, welcome to Evergreen Marketing Era for Women Entrepreneurs. I'm your host, Andrea Singletary, podcast strategist for women in business who want to leverage podcasting to grow their email list and sign clients. Since starting this podcast almost 4 years ago, which is so crazy to say, I have pivoted my business twice and have rebranded this podcast twice. I actually shared the behind the scenes of my first rebrand back in episode 211. That's when I rebranded from Mama Turned Mompreneur to Marketing Without Socials for Moms. Anytime you make a major shift in your business, so again, your messaging has drastically changed, or you've completely revamped your offers, or you have a completely new audience you're trying to reach, I recommend rebranding your podcast. As your business evolves, your podcast needs to follow suit if you want to, continue to leverage the platform to grow your business. So if you're shifting your messaging drastically or trying to reach a new audience, you will need to change your podcast name and update your cover art to ensure you are reaching the most aligned listeners. You're also going to want to, update your podcast description, all of that stuff, where it's really going to allow you to be able to target this new audience you're trying to reach. Now, as far as your previous episodes go, so your old episodes, you don't need to do anything with them. Since they are valuable, you can go through your archive and look at possibly pulling out topics that will be relevant to your new target audience or aligns with your new messaging and create new episodes around those topics. Now, I talked more about how to do this back in episode 298. I highly recommend you check that one out. I share a lot of good, juicy details on different ways you can do this, especially if you find yourself in like a content rut. It's such an incredible strategy. Now, something else you're going to want to do is make sure that the first episode you publish under your rebrand is a reintroduction / deep dive into why you changed the name, who the podcast is now for, and what listeners can expect going forward. So for an example of this, check out episode 280. This was actually the first episode I did this year, so 2026, when I brought the podcast back under a new name. And so it kind of gives you kind of like an example of what that looks like, kind of reintroducing yourself and sharing your new vision and direction for your podcast. Now, this is something I also recently supported one of my Evergreen Marketing Accelerator clients with. She had completely pivoted in her business, but hadn't made the same pivot with her podcast. And so at first, she was still creating content for her previous audience for the sake of consistency, but she hated doing that. Like, she eventually stopped her podcast because the content she was creating no longer felt aligned with her business. And so she knew she needed to pivot the podcast to be able to stick with it. And so this is what we did to actually pivot her podcast. First, we looked at how she pivoted her business. So what her new offers were, who her ideal client is, the language her ideal clients are using, and what problems she helps them solve. And so this allowed us to brainstorm new names for her podcast that would really communicate this new messaging and attract the right listeners. After that, we looked at how we could attract more of the new right listeners to her podcast since her current listeners were no longer aligned. So we used my customer journey framework and we really focused on planning awareness stage content. So this is the type of content that would be considered like top of funnel content because it's going to attract people to your podcast. It's basically how you get leads. Specifically, we brainstorm podcast resource library content. So I've talked about this concept a lot on the podcast, but basically this is the type of content in which you answer your ideal clients' FAQs. And so the goal is to create episodes that your target audience is actively searching for right now. And this is making it easier for you to show up in search and again, getting in front of those people who are actively seeking out the solutions that you have. Now, by getting clear on these things, it really helped my client to pivot her podcast and get back to publishing new episodes because she really wasn't able to move forward with her podcast. She felt this kind of pull in two directions because she was still trying to serve her older audience, but then her new focus is this new audience and everything. And so she really needed to just completely shift the podcast so she wasn't being pulled in two directions and she could be consistent with her podcast. She could, get back to publishing her episodes and actually enjoy it, not feeling like, she's doing something just to please someone else, not feeling that resentment and everything. And so this is like one of the biggest things, like when you pivot your business and you have a podcast, you got to pivot the podcast too, because if not, you're going to be out of alignment and you're going to feel it. And it's going to create this friction for you and your business. And you're not going to be able to stick with the podcast because it's no longer serving your business. It's no longer supporting your business growth. It's no longer part of your business, essentially, because it's still geared towards that old audience, that old messaging and everything. So like I was saying, when you pivot your business, you have to pivot your podcast. I've seen far too many times clients quit their podcast because it no longer matched their business. You don't need to keep publishing episodes just for the sake of consistency if your podcast no longer supports your business. I would rather you pause, rebrand your podcast, and plan new content that aligns with the new direction of your business than to keep churning out content that no longer serves the purpose you need it to. And it can be hard to do this because you may feel like you're letting down, your former audience, or you're essentially doing something wrong. But the reality is that if it's no longer aligned and no longer what you do, the best thing you can do is pivot because you're no longer serving that audience. And so you have to make that shift. Now, this is just one example of what I support my clients with inside of the Evergreen Marketing Accelerator. I've walked alongside a few clients who've had to rebrand or relaunch their podcast, and they felt confident doing so because we developed a solid strategy. And so if you're in the process of pivoting your business and need to get your podcast on board with the pivot, I would love to support you inside of the accelerator. We'll map out your relaunch and rebrand strategy, including renaming your podcast, planning strategic content to attract your new target audience, optimize your podcast for search, and so much more. Applications are now open with the next round starting on October 1st. So head on over to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/accelerator to learn more and apply. I have linked this below in the episode description and in the show notes. All right, I'll catch you in the next episode.